Professor O'Connor, welcome and thank you very much for joining us today.
I'm delighted to be here, Martina. I'm really excited to join you today.
We already know each other, but I will briefly introduce myself. I'm Martina Medolla, and I'm a professor in the Master's Program in Suicide Prevention at Madrid Open University, UDIMA, which together with the PhD program in Mental Health and Suicide Prevention in Digital Era reflects UDIMA's strong institutional commitment to advancing research, training, and intervention in the field of suicidal prevention. We know that you have been interviewed several times recently in Spain, which clearly show the growing academic and public interest in suicide prevention, and in particular in your integrated motivational volitional model, IMV, one of the most influential model in current suicide research. It's truly a privilege for us to have the opportunity to speak with you today about your work, its clinical and preventive application, and the future direction in the understanding and prevention of suicidal behavior. Let's start with the first question. To begin, your MV model has had an enormous impact internationally. If you have to revisit it today, in light of everything we know, which conceptual component would you modify or expand?
That's a really interesting question and something I have reflected on. And I suppose that when I think about the development of the IMV model, so I first developed it in 2011, and then actually in 2018, I updated the model, and with my colleague Olivia Kirtley. So actually in that intervening 7 years, I did reflect on the modifications I could make to the model. And actually one of the things I made in terms of the modification in 2018, along with Olivia, we clarified in more detail the volitional phase of the model. So I think that's been an important development of the model. Now, in terms of continued reflections, it's been really encouraging that now as the model has been used more internationally, that the key constructs of defeat, humiliation, and entrapment, they seem to be universal, and they seem to be important for suicide risk. Doesn't matter if you're in Spain, in the UK, in Africa, or wherever it is in the world. But I suppose the thing we still need more work on is that in the end of the motivational phase, I've got suicidal ideation and intent as a combined factor. And as we wrote about in 2018, the reason we hadn't disentangled suicidal ideation from suicidal intent is that we don't know enough about the differences between different types of suicidal thoughts, such that you might have passive ideation, or you might have active ideation, and then intent to act on your thoughts. So for me, moving forward, I'd be really keen to try and develop that nuance around suicidal ideation and intent in more detail.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on the next question. The IMB model explained very well how someone moves from suicidal thoughts to suicidal behavior. Do you think it will be possible to develop an inverse model, one that explains how others manage to stop that process and rebuild their desire to live?
Yeah, again, that's a really interesting question. So an inverse model or a protective factors model. And I suppose that my immediate response to that is that within the IMV model, there are components which are looking at what protects people. So if we're trying to understand vulnerability, which doesn't lead to suicidal thoughts, and then people who have suicidal thoughts who are more or less likely to act on their thoughts. So in some senses, I think the IMV model does have an inverse component, but I think we need to do more to look at what else can protect people. What are the broader societal factors? In particular, if I think about the pre-motivational phase of the model, the pre-motivational phase has those three key components: diathesis or vulnerability, environmental influences, and thirdly, then negative life events. So I suppose if I was reflecting on what else we can include in the environmental component in terms of this inverse model, yeah, I think we could be looking at what are the broader societal protective factors. At a society level, how can we promote human connection on a global scale, at a public health scale? What else can we do when people encounter negative life events, especially in early life? And early life adversity, as we know, is a key risk factor for suicidal thoughts and behaviors. What else can we do at a public health level to ameliorate, to weaken the negative impact of those early life trauma factors? So for me, that's the sort of things I think an inverse model needs to have. At a public health level in particular, what else can protect society? So we can have a world which more people want to live in that world rather than wanting to die.
Thank you very much for that insight. Now I'd like to shift to another key aspect. In recent years, there has been growing interest in using artificial intelligence to predict suicide risk. Do you think that variables such as entrapment and hopelessness, which are so central in suicidal experience, could truly be captured by a specific algorithm?
Well, another really interesting question. And although I welcome the new developments in terms of artificial intelligence and using algorithms, we need to be really cautious. That's the first thing to say, is that remember, at the heart of understanding suicide risk is a person's story, a person's life, a person's experience of good and bad events in their life. And it's really important that we situate suicide prevention centrally into people's lives. Now, do I believe there's an important role for AI and algorithms in understanding suicide risk and concepts like entrapment? Yes, there is. Of course, there is. In terms of your direct question, yes, I do think we can make progress, especially if we look at ecological momentary assessment techniques, so ambulatory assessment, moment to moment, hour by hour changes and fluctuations in entrapment and suicidal thinking and defeat and humiliation. Yes, algorithms which can help us look at those fluctuations to see, because each one of us will have a unique pattern of fluctuations in entrapment. And maybe in the future, using AI and algorithms, we'll be able to better identify a particular pattern of fluctuations or changes in entrapment which are associated with future suicide risk. So yes, that is an opportunity for the future, but what's vitally important though is that we remember, as I said already, people's stories and narratives, that has to be the heart of understanding suicide risk. And then just one last thing which excites me about the future related to algorithms and AI, and that is this idea of just-in-time interventions. So if we have, especially in a crisis situation, we can identify a pattern of changes in entrapment or changes in suicidal thoughts in this moment-to-moment way. Hopefully we can develop interventions to protect people in the moments in which they're most vulnerable. That's my hope and aspiration, that we combine AI and algorithms with broader public health interventions as well as standard clinical interventions. That's how we'll save lives.
Okay, thank you. I think it's extremely interesting. Finally, we'd like to ask you something more personal from research point of view. After so many years dedicated to studying suicidal behavior, is there something you have learned from survivors that doesn't quite appear in the theoretical models?
So a really interesting question. I've learned so much from people with lived experience and living experience of suicide, and it really has informed my work in such a central way. I suppose a couple of things come to mind in respect of that question. Speaking to people who've been suicidal or people who've been bereaved by suicide, you get a real sense of the mental pain that people who are suicidal experience. And often it's difficult to get a sense of that if we just look at quantitative measures. So for me, that insight has been invaluable to get a sense of that pain. But the other important message, I think, and there's many messages, many things I've learned over my journey, in suicide research. But one word summarizes what I've really learned, and that's compassion. Is that people with lived experience are often so compassionate, so sensitive, but what I've taken from what they've told me about their stories is that we need to be so much more compassionate in the world, to be compassionate with people who do struggle. But that compassion also extends to being compassionate to those who are supporting or caring for people who are suicidal. And also the last bit of compassion, which is so, so important, is that we all need to be compassionate towards ourselves. Self-compassion is absolutely vital. If you're studying suicide research, if you're working with people who are suicidal, if you are struggling yourself, or if you're bereaved by suicide, we need to be so much more compassionate. It's really tough. And if you've been bereaved by suicide, it's absolutely devastating. So self-compassion, as well as compassion for those working and supporting people who are suicidal, as well as the people who are suicidal themselves, that's the key thing I've learned from people who've lived and living experience.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience and for being here with us today. We hope to see you soon in Madrid, and we trust this will mark the beginning of a productive collaboration. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Martina. That was great. And for those who are studying, the very best of luck in your studies. It's a great program. Thank you.
Thank you.